Andy said, my name is Jelisa Scott, and I am a board certified behavior analyst. And I am excited to talk with you guys about minimizing meltdowns, challenging behavior. So I'm going to share my screen. So we're going to talk about minimizing challenging behaviors. But before we get into that, I wanted to really break down and make sure everyone understood what ABA is. So ABA stands for Applied Behavior Analysis. And this particular science, it helps us understand how our environment impacts our behaviors. And it focuses heavily on the use of reinforcement-based interventions to improve behaviors. Over the years, since this has been applied, it has been shown to be very helpful for children with autism, but it's beneficial for any being that behaves, which is all of us, right? So there is a difference. So I am a board certified behavior analyst, but you may also have done work or experienced or be a behavior technician. So I wanted to kind of break down the differences between the two and how both of us are really working together for the same cause. So a BCBA, or that board certified behavior analyst, they have obtained a master's level of education, and they are certified by the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. And that usually means that required more field experience hours. So as Sandy said, I've been working in this field since 2008, and I've experienced a wide range of behaviors, from aggression to self-injurious behaviors like headbanging to what's called operant vomiting, where the children can make themselves throw up on cue, to tantrums, crying, you name it, I have worked with it. BCBAs also are the ones who are developing and implementing behavior intervention plans, and they supervise the behavior technicians. Behavior technicians, they have a bachelor's level of education with fewer field experience hours, but they still have that experience. And so with that helpful experience, they're able to implement behavior intervention plans with high integrity, meaning that they know what they're doing, and they're collecting data on the progress of those behavior goals, and they're monitoring the effectiveness. So essentially, sometimes we might be doing things that we think is helpful, and those behavior technicians are there tracking, and they're saying, yes, this child is making progress, or no, we need to kind of rethink some things and adjust what we're doing. So I hope that helped clears up the differences, but both definitely go hand in hand. So an overview of what I'll be talking about today. So understanding and identifying behaviors, that's what we're going to hit on first. And then we're going to get into the functions of behaviors, the causes of challenging behaviors, and then lastly, we'll end out with some effective interventions that you can apply. So I really want to emphasize that there is no such thing as a bad kid. Children are learning how to get their needs met, and it's normal for children to misbehave sometimes. But our job as parents and as therapists is to teach them how to behave correctly. So when your child misbehaves, they're not just bad. I really want to make sure that everyone listening, we're going to throw that term out of our vocabulary when we're describing children, even if they've done something that is problematic, like hit their friend or they hit you. They're not being bad. It just means they haven't learned what they should do to get their needs met. And that behavior is the most effective behavior that they've figured out how to do to get that need met. So this is where some interventions and some therapy comes in, right? So it's important to know that all behavior is lawful. Even if it just happens out the blue, you don't know why they're doing that. Oh my gosh, they're screaming again. It's lawful. There's a reason for it. And what we need to understand is that behavior is anything a person does. So we tend to maybe sometimes project our own emotions onto the child instead of just looking at what is it that they actually did, and understand that all behavior serves a purpose. This means that there's some type of function, which we'll be talking about momentarily, but there's a reason behind why they've done what they did, even if we don't know what that reason is. And then it's also important to remember there's no behavior that is good or bad. We're not labeling or categorizing these behaviors. It's just an action that is fulfilling its purpose. We might not like those actions sometimes, but it doesn't mean that they are good or bad. So, when you're identifying challenging behavior, before you can even decrease the behavior, you have to know how to identify it. So there are a few questions that you need to be asking yourself and you need to be looking for before you can just jump in and throw in an intervention. Because sometimes when we jump in without knowing what the behavior is, we're unintentionally reinforcing it and making that behavior get a little bit worse than what our intentions are. So you want to ask yourself, what does the behavior look like? Are they jumping up and down and screaming? Are they slapping their hands on the table? Are they throwing all their materials across the room? What does the behavior look like? And then you need to ask yourself, how long has this behavior been happening? Is this something that has been happening day after day after day? Or is this something that just started happening maybe a few days ago and there might be something else going on with the child beyond what we can see? And then you also want to ask, how severe is this behavior? We want to really make sure that we've got a handle on things that could really cause harm to themselves or to other people, or that's super disruptive. So you want to make sure that you're gauging the severity of the behavior. So, for example, when you are talking with other parents or when you're talking with other therapists, if you're just describing and you're not giving specific details, like this particular mom saying, my child just goes crazy when he's mad. The other two, anyone else that's working with your child, they won't know what crazy looks like. They don't know what mad looks like. It's not giving us what the behavior actually is. It's us projecting our emotions. It's us describing what we're feeling when this behavior happens, but it's not very helpful in actually addressing the behavior. So instead of this, you want to change your language to really give descriptive details of what is actually happening. My child screams and jumps up and down when he's mad. Now that's clear. Now when they're in their classrooms, now when they are with other people, when they start screaming and jumping up and down, that is going to be a clear indication that, oh, he's mad, he's upset. Let's try to figure it out, versus they're just going crazy. I hope that makes sense. So why do they do that? Why are kids having these behaviors? How come some kids are easier to manage than others? Well, there are four functions, but I'm going to talk about first the three main social functions. So we engage, because this is same for everyone, not just for children, but for us as well. People engage in behaviors to either escape or avoid work, instructions, demands. They're doing things so they can get out of a situation. They're doing things so they can escape a setting, whatever it may be. That's a particular function. The next function is getting attention from family or friends that can be physical or vocal. So even if you think that, oh, well, I reprimanded, I told him to stop, I told him not to do that, and we don't expect that here, that's still attention. And if your child has attention maintained behavior, they're not really worried about what it is you're saying to them. All that they see is, I got you to give me attention and not anybody else. So I'm going to keep doing these things so I can get your attention. And then the third social function is accessing those tangible goods, those concrete toys, items, activities, snacks that can be accessed for some type of enjoyment. So that's when you have taken away some toys, the child starts crying and engaging in their behaviors, and then you give them the toys back, or they're able to find some other toys. And then there is one non-social function. This means that the behavior happens when there's no social interaction from anybody else. And this is that sensory function. The sensory stimulation satisfies something inside. It doesn't need another person to help them escape or get attention or access something. They're able to fulfill that need through whatever sensories and sensations that they're going for. Sometimes we see this a lot with headbanging. And what happens is that the children may have something internal going on, like a headache or some pounding. And you might notice that they're hitting when no one's around, when you haven't done anything, when you're playing with them. That's because there's something internal that they're needing to satisfy, and they don't have the appropriate means of communication to express what they need. So what causes these behaviors? We now know that everything is lawful. There's a function for it. So why does it happen? Well, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked. So there are events that occur before the behavior happens. These are also called antecedents. And this creates a situation for the behavior to occur. And then there are also events that happen after the behavior happens. These are called consequences, and these maintain, increase, or decrease the behaviors. Take note that I didn't say that consequences were they got sent to the corner, or they got a spanking, or they got any type of punishment. Consequences aren't good or bad. Remember, we're leaving those labels out of this. We're just going to call it what it is, and these are just events that happen after the behavior that alter the effects of the behavior, whether it maintains it, it increases the behavior, or it decreases the behavior. So there are some ABCs of ABA, which is very good for you to remember kind of the pattern in which you need to be thinking about how to address behaviors and how to identify and really figure out what is that cause, what is that function. So the A stands for antecedent. That's the event that occurs before the behavior happens. The B is the actual behavior, the action that the person does. And then C is your consequence, the event that occurs after the behavior has passed. So these are your ABCs. So when the behavior happens, you need to kind of either consult with your other therapists or consult with the parents, or really try to reflect in your memory. I know this is easier said than done, but thinking about, well, what was the antecedent? What happened right before the behavior occurred? The friend took his toy. Okay. And then he pushed his friend. What was the consequence? The friend let go of the toy and he got his toy back. So now do you see how the next time that child wants something, they'll be more likely to engage in the behavior of pushing, because that consequence was them getting access to an item again. So let's look at another example. Let's say we've got some delicious snacks, some treats, and we have this wonderful child who yells out, "Cookie!" They get their cookie as their reinforcement. This is an example of how those ABCs of ABA aren't necessarily just for problem behavior. We want to make sure that the behavior itself is an appropriate behavior. So instead of her yelling and screaming and falling to the floor and getting a cookie, she learns the word, or if she's not able to vocally communicate, she learns the sign, she learns the picture exchange, she learns something that's appropriate in order to get access to the thing that she wanted. And you will see that the problem behavior will start to go down because they have an alternative behavior to engage in that's much more appropriate. So again, the functions of behavior are escape or avoiding a situation, obtaining attention, getting access to items or activities, and sensory stimulation. So we're going to talk about the antecedents for each one because they look different. There are lots of different functions, and lots of different kids have different functions of behaviors that might be the cause behind why they're doing things. So some common antecedents for escape maintained behavior is when you've given them an instruction or a task. So you've told them to do something. That's an antecedent. It can also be an ongoing work or demand situation. So school is a very common one. So even if you're like, oh, I haven't even given them anything, they just started acting up the moment they walked through these doors. That's because school in its entirety, what it symbolizes is I've got to learn, I've got to work, I've got to do things that I might not want to do. And the child, or if the child is expected to be working or following instructions. And then another antecedent for escape maintained behavior is going to a place that's associated with discomfort or work. So this could be places that have large crowds, that have loud noises. A lot of times children with autism, they do have some type of sensory need where too much stimulation is aversive to them. So they may engage in behaviors to try to escape that situation and go to somewhere that's a little bit calmer or a little bit quieter. Now, consequences for escape maintained behavior. What happens is that the demander tasks are typically removed. If they start engaging in screaming, tantruming, aggression, they're no longer required to do that work. Or the completion of the task or instruction is delayed or removed because the adult's attention is diverted. So you started looking at something else, you didn't notice them getting out of their work or not doing what they were told to do. The parent or the teacher starts doing the task for the child. They throw all their toys around, the parent just starts cleaning it up for them because it's faster to do that than to make them do it. Or they continue to repeat the initial instruction, but they never actually make the child do it. It's just a lot of words, a lot of instructions, but the child is never encouraged to try on their own to do it. Or the child is sent to time out or gets punished in some other way. Even though you think you might be disciplining the child, what's happening is they're escaping whatever that initial task is, and you're actually reinforcing whatever behavior occurred because they'll start to learn, every time they tell me to do this, all I have to do is engage in a tantrum and then I get sent away. Then I don't ever have to do it. So you want to make that you're not actually giving them what they want if their behavior is maintained by escape. And then the last consequence is the child leaves the area where the instruction was given. They get up and go. We've got some runners sometimes, and they just run out. They run away and they're not made to do it once they are brought back to their classroom setting or back to the room. So the next function is attention. And antecedents for attention are typically the removal of attention. So you did not acknowledge the child, you did not speak to the child, you did not look at the child, or their attempts to obtain attention are being ignored. So they've been calling out for you in whatever way that they best know how, but either you didn't hear it, you weren't able to get to them, whatever it may be, that is the perfect setting for some type of behavior to happen. So let's say this behavior is screaming. You've removed your attention, you're not giving it to them, they engage in the behavior, they scream at the top of their lungs. Common consequences following that behavior have typically been reprimands or firm instruction. So don't do that. We don't yell like that. That's not how we act here. Some type of statement of concern, like, oh, everything's okay. I'm so sorry. I'm here right now. It could be a neutral statement. And by neutral statements, meaning you start engaging with them, but you aren't actually addressing the behavior that happened. So, oh, wow, look at you sitting over here. I love your shirt. You start interacting with them in some shape, form, or fashion. Another consequence is physical contact only. So you pick them up, you rub them, you pat them, you make sure that you're trying to soothe them, giving instructions or redirections. And then lastly, sometimes giggles or laughter at their behavior. All of these consequences for attention inadvertently increase the behavior if that is attention maintained. So you might think again that you are disciplining them. You've got to correct them in that moment. However, if their function, if their purpose for engaging in the behavior was to get your attention, then what you've done is inadvertently increased that particular problem behavior instead of modeling for them an appropriate way to get your attention and get their needs met. Remember again, behavior is all about finding a way to get their needs met. So the next one is antecedents for tangibles. So those items and activities, the events that occur before behavior maintained by access to tangible items is the removal of a preferred item or activity, or their desired item is out of reach, or their requests are being ignored or denied for certain toys or activities. Any one of these things can ultimately trigger behavior that's maintained by access to these things. Following the behavior, common consequences for tangible items are the delivery of an item or activity. So you give it back. You just, oh, you're crying, you're screaming. So here, you can have this iPad. Here, you can play with your trucks. Or the child obtains the desired item coincidentally. So it doesn't mean that an adult gave it to them. They maybe found where you put all their toys and they got it on their own. Or the child is given another item. So it might not be the item originally requested or removed, but they did get something after they've engaged in this problematic behavior. And then lastly, the child obtains a different item coincidentally. So you didn't give them anything, another adult didn't give them anything, but they kind of looked around and like, okay, I don't need that particular toy. I'll play with this thing. All in all, at the end of the day, the consequences that followed their behavior were they got access to something again. So when they want something, what they're learning is, that worked. I can do this same challenging behavior again and I will get something. Even if it's not the thing that I initially wanted, it's something that I can enjoy and engage with. So we want to make sure that we really know what the purpose of their behavior is before we start actually doing things. And then lastly, we're going to talk about those antecedents for sensory behaviors. These are behaviors that occur regardless of any social event. So you can get access to, they could have access to attention, they could have access to items, they're engaged in their preferred activities and no demands are being given. And they still may engage in some type of behavior that is repetitive and stimulating some sensory need. And these tend to occur at high levels when the person is alone or unattended. And so the consequences for sensory, it's a little bit tricky because remember, these aren't things that are socially mediated. So the behavior tends to continue to occur no matter the type of consequence. That means you tried removing your attention. You've tried reprimanding them. Toys were given to them. You even sent them to timeout or tried some punishment and they still engaged in behavior. This is where you've definitely got to collaborate with an occupational therapist or looking into how to address those sensory needs so that way they can help regulate themselves, which I know we've got some lovely speakers coming up after me that will address that. So we've talked about all of these functions in isolation, but behavior is multifunctional. This means that it can be maintained by more than one function. There can be multiple antecedents and consequences that can occur simultaneously. What this means is that different events can cause the same behavior at the same time. You could have told them and gave them an instruction and removed their access to their favorite toy. Those are two different antecedents that are for escape maintain behavior and access to tangibles that produce the behavior. So make sure you're thinking about the whole picture. Did I tell them that playtime was over and it's time to come sit down and do their work? You've now had two things that happened that could trigger behavior to occur, and you need to address it carefully. So how do we address it? We've talked about all the behaviors. We've talked about all the ways that behaviors can happen. Let's get into some effective interventions that you could apply for these particular behaviors that are maintained by these functions. So interventions for escape maintained behavior. Also another note, these are general interventions. So it really does require you to kind of make sure that you are asking those questions and tracking how often these behaviors are happening and identifying what that function is first before you apply these interventions. But for interventions for escape maintained behavior, what has been shown to be effective and helpful for some children is when you divide up the amount of time required to work into smaller time intervals. So if you know that your little learner can't sit for 30 minutes at a time, 20 minutes at a time, let's break it down. Let's make it smaller. Let's do 5 minutes. They get 5 minutes of work, and then, woo, they can have 10 minutes of play, and divide it up like that. So that way it's not so hard for them, and you can slowly start to encourage them to sit for longer. But in the beginning, divide that into smaller time. The next one is to teach and allow them to ask for short breaks. So you've instructed them, they can say, break please, I need a break. They can sign break, whatever that modality is in which they communicate. Help them understand that they have the power and they can ask for breaks, and you will honor that if they need to rest a little bit. The next one is to reward them with longer breaks with access to their preferred items after compliance with the initial instruction. So even if you had to help them a little bit, if they complied without engaging in their problem behavior, in that targeted challenging behavior, give them a reward. Be like, you were so great. Go take a break. You can play with these toys. I'm gonna come back after this timer dings. Let them know that they've done well, even if it was just that first step. You're trying to build that momentum up. And then next is to follow through with the initial instruction being given before giving a new instruction. Sometimes we kind of go and we're like, do this, touch that, do this, but they haven't even really processed that first one. So you might need to help them follow through with actually completing whatever that initial instruction was with whatever levels of assistance that they require before having them go and get frustrated because you've told them 4 or 5 different tasks and they haven't completed the first one. And then lastly, block attempts to escape or avoid the situation. So if they've engaged in their problem behavior, that is not their ticket to get out of it. You've got to redirect them back to where they were and help them engage in the appropriate alternative behavior, whether it's using a break card or using a sign to request for some time away from the task. So some common interventions for attention maintained behavior is to provide high quality attention periodically throughout the day. Many of these kiddos, sometimes it's easy for them to slip through the cracks when they're being quiet because you're like, oh, great, everyone is so quiet and happy. But that's the time that you want to be catching them while they're behaving the way that you want them to behave, while they're doing something appropriate. I love how you're sitting down. Oh my gosh, you're so amazing. Giving them that high quality attention periodically throughout the day will minimize their motivation to obtain your attention because they've been getting it. It's the same concept of kind of when we eat until we're full. You don't want to kind of deprive them or starve them of attention. You want them to have enough so that way they're satiated. That way they have no motivation to actually fight for your attention. You also want to praise appropriate behaviors often. It's easy to expect, well, they were supposed to do that. That was what we expected of them to do. That's fine, but everyone likes to get some encouragement. And our children, especially children with developmental disabilities like autism, they're no different. And they might want a little bit more just to know that, hey, I am doing well. And that will increase the likelihood of them doing that behavior again in the future. And then the last one, this is easier said than done. However, you must limit attention following the challenging behavior. That means cutting short those long descriptions of why what they did was wrong and why they shouldn't do it again. Redirect them quickly, make sure that they are safe, but they don't get the same quality and duration and one-on-one attention following that challenging behavior. That type of attention is only saved for when they're engaging in appropriate behaviors. And then next, interventions for behavior maintained by access to items and activities. This is where you've got to do some environmental rearrangement. You may have to store items out of reach from your child if you know that just they cannot let go of it. Keep them up, and then that way they can work to earn access to it. And then the next one is you want to reward appropriate communication in whatever way, in whatever modality that they communicate for the item and activity. And then lastly, you want to prevent access to the items following challenging behavior. So if they've hit their friend, or if they hit you, or they threw all their things across the room, that behavior does not get followed by access to the items. They need to engage in something appropriate. They need to show that they have calmed down. They need to regulate their breathing, and then appropriately request for the things that they wanted. And we're not going to hold grudges against the children. Once they've done the thing that is appropriate, that's what we want to reinforce. That's the thing that we want to see happen again. So we don't have to talk about the challenging behavior, the bad behavior. We just keep going and we tell them, I love when you use your words. I love that you're being calm. Yes, now you can play with XYZ. And then lastly, some interventions for behavior maintained by sensory stimulation. You can provide and allow access to the items that compete with the behavior. So if there's something that they're doing with their hands, giving them some manipulatives, giving them some toys that match that sensory stimulation that they're seeking internally, that they can get in appropriate play. And those play items, that those things that can stimulate them in an appropriate way instead of them maybe unintentionally harming themselves. You can designate certain areas of the house or the room or certain times where they can engage in the behaviors. Sometimes these behaviors can be vocal and disruptive and they're making loud noises. It's okay if they do that at recess or if they do that at their break, and then you can teach them, oh, when it's work time, we need to do this task, and then you can go and engage in those behaviors if the behavior is not severe. And then lastly, you want to block and redirect any behaviors that are harmful or disruptive. Sometimes that's using soft cushions, soft pillows, but if there's any behaviors that they're engaging in for that sensory stimulation that could cause harm to themselves, you want to block that so that way they can be as safe as possible. So I know that I covered a lot of things and a lot of interventions, but it is important that you don't see any child that you're working with, whether they have autism, whether they have ADHD, whether they have any developmental disability or not. You don't see them as a bad child, because our children are not bad. And punishment alone does not improve behaviors. Notice that I did not talk about any punishments during those interventions, because it does not teach them anything new. You want them to learn what is appropriate so that way they can start engaging in that behavior to get their needs met. You're going to also need to know this is going to take some time. So you're going to need to be consistent with the things that you do and be patient with your learners, because they're trying. Every day is a new day for them. Every day is filled with struggles. So you've got to be consistent and patient. And lastly, reward the behaviors that you want to see. Acknowledge that. Give them those toys that they love if they've done the things that you wanted them to engage in, if they're doing the appropriate behaviors. Okay? I hope this was helpful. Thank you all so much for listening. And like Sandy said, I will be happy to answer any questions that you have at the end of this workshop.